Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture. I'm really pleased to introduce Annette LaRocco, who is the Dan and Betty Churchill Professor in Climate Policy and International Affairs. She's in the Department of Political Science and the School of Policy and International Affairs. This is her first year here at the University of Maine. She does research on environmental policy in Africa and recently published her first book on this topic, The Nature of Politics, State Building and Conservation of State in Post-Colonial Botswana. Today, Annette is giving us a talk for her affiliation with CCI on, you can see it there, Mother Nature, question mark, interrogating gendered environmental and climate policy initiatives in Southern Africa. Annette, all yours.
Stan. Thanks to everyone to be here on this, chilly day. We're going to go a little warmer, Southern Africa, so we'll just get in that headspace. So as Dan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about an ongoing project that I have, and I'll also, just to give a little context, kind of speak a little bit about my broader research agenda and touch a little bit on some of the strands that come out of my book project that are relevant to my current research, as well as sort of other avenues of research that I think have overlap with CCI. So I do want to just start a little bit to situate my research agenda. So as Dan mentioned, I'm interested in climate and environmental politics in Africa, specifically Southern Africa, with additional specializations in gender and the relationships to the environment and climate, and uses of decolonial IR, so decolonial international relations, to understand the relationship of African states and communities within broader global environmental and climate politics. I try to think about the relationship between citizen and state, as well as between state and the international system, and consider kind of the broader geopolitics around the climate and environment that it might be unique to the global south, but Africa as well. I also would argue that the African context is a place where we can think about climate and environmental politics quite differently. So if we think about the suites of policy initiatives that are focused on climate change and climate change transformation in the global north, they are focused on how to think about large economies that industrialized in the 19th and 20th centuries, transitioning to renewable energies, thinking about restoring land and resources that have been degraded by earlier periods of industrialization. But if we move the lens to the global south, it's quite different. In the global south, we're talking about things like technological leapfrogging and climate financing, but also questions of land tenure, land use, agriculture, biodiversity conservation, tied up into policies like REDD, payment for ecosystem services. And all of this really implicates what's happening on the ground in small communities in ways that might be a little bit different from other contexts, especially in Southern Africa, but the continent more broadly. We're talking about a place with very low per capita private vehicle ownership, for example, heterogeneous access to electricity, very small industrial sectors. So what does climate transformation and what does policy look like in these spaces? So we do need to really take seriously those interconnections between land use management, particularly because the way in which sort of global carbon sinks are identified in these developing spaces more so than in the developed world. In my research agenda, I always try to frame the human, political, social, and economic impacts of any kind of environmental or climate policy as sort of very high on our list of things that we need to understand, recognizing that these interventions are not strictly ecological, but they're of course always already political from the beginning. I do want to briefly touch on a little bit from my book, just some key findings that connect to my current project, as well as findings that I think will helpfully kind of situate why my work is germane to CCI. So as Dan mentioned, The Nature of Politics came out in 2024 with Ohio University Press in their Research and International Studies series, focusing on Africa, their series. And what it tries to do is unpack the social, political, and economic impacts of environmental and climate policies in Botswana. It's a single case study, thinking about how post-colonial state building is in part also an environmental practice, not strictly one that is sort of political and making environment apolitical. Two important findings that I want to touch on because of their connection to my current project is the way that in this book, I try to redefine or enrich the definition of what I call the conservation estate. In most socio-ecological literature, this is a concept that is kind of apolitically rendered, right? The land that is set aside for environmental or conservation ends. And what my definition is trying to do is highlight that the constituent parts of this, controlling land, policing behavior, structuring economies, structuring state authority, are all deeply political practices. And we can understand the conservation estate as a category of land that is important for its political components, not simply its ecological ones. And this is really salient for kind of the broader trajectory of my ongoing research because of the way in which global environmental governance is pushing to expand the conservation estate broadly in the global south. So if we think about the Aichi targets from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is trying to expand the amount of land that would be kind of classed in this frame, or the Half Earth Initiative, which is a consortium between environmental activists, scientists, NGOs that are pushing for 50% of terrestrial territory. Well, that's redundant, but 50% of terrestrial conservation globally, but it's almost exclusively looking at places in the global south to kind of add to this tally. So we kind of need to work through the political implications of those pushes, and that's what I think makes the conservation estate a really live concept in my later projects. The other key finding from this book that directly connects to my current project that I'm going to talk about briefly is the way in which my research and my broader research agenda problematizes this concept of ecotourism. So I like, to put in the quotes, and in my book and in my writing, I talk about it as nature-based or wildlife-based tourism, because the way in which once you bring a climate analysis into ecotourism, you're already problematizing the eco part of that. So ecotourism, I will dispense with the air quotes for now, but ecotourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry, largely cited in areas of the global south, though not exclusively. But it is one of the major places where countries and economies in the global south intersect with citizens from wealthier OECD countries. It's typically presented as a kind of green or ecological form of beneficial tourism, promoted by governments, international organizations. UNDP is a big proponent. Multilateral donors. There had been large USAID grants focused on ecotourism. But this kind of endeavor is very climate intensive, right? So it's based on long haul flights from Europe and North America to places in Southern and Eastern Africa, private planes to get to very remote camps in the middle of wilderness spaces. And almost all of these remote camps, and in fact, all the ones that I worked through in my fieldwork, are powered by diesel generators for their electricity. And so the climate aspect of this sort of seemingly benign ecotourism is something that I'm trying to problematize and think my way through in my book and then in my later work, in part because the land management in the global south is often said to pay its way via this kind of luxury tourism, which is very carbon and resource intensive. So thinking about how the published work fits into my later and current trajectory, the first is how generalizable or useful is taking this concept of the conservation estate and applying it to other spaces. So it comes from a single case study from my work on Botswana. But I would argue that while Botswana is unique in the scope of its land management for environmental ends, it's not fully idiosyncratic, right? There are other places around the world where this idea might have a bit of purchase. And then I really want to think through the implications of the conservationist state in critical climate studies. The suite of initiatives, especially in Africa and the global south more broadly, that are focused on maintaining the world's carbon sinks. So your payment for ecosystem services model, REDD+, that require the protecting and separating from human activity certain tracts of land as carbon sinks, sort of as global carbon sinks, global reserves there. So it's really helpful to think through what the implications of this mean and what we can learn from critical conservation studies in a critical climate context. But the main event for today is my current project. So my current project is focused on gendered interactions and gendered relations in environment and climate policy initiatives. Specifically in Southern Africa is where I've done my fieldwork, although there are some relevant initiatives in Eastern Africa right now as well. So these have become very common in the last 10 or 12 years, the idea of bringing women into historically male-dominated spaces of the environmental workforce. So this could look like climate and ecosystem monitors, rangers, a set of what are called eco guides, and then a program called the Solar Mamas, which I'm going to talk about in depth later. So these are programs that are said to have beneficial environmental impacts, but also empowering women and communities locally. They get a lot of attention from private donors and foundation funding. They also have at least tacit support of the state governments in which they operate, although I'll talk through how in some places that support is sort of more benign neglect than anything else. But they also have a lot of attention from international donors. So there was in Zambia, actually, a USAID funded all-female ecosystem monitor team that I believe now obviously does not have that funding anymore, but nonetheless, they're kind of situated at these interstitial connection points between international development and environment. So why are these very important? One is that they are growing rapidly. Just as an example, one of the teams that I've been following is a team called Akashinga. This means brave ones in the Shona language in Zimbabwe. They started out only in Zimbabwe, and very recently, within the last 2 years, they've decided to expand their work not only in Zimbabwe, but to Botswana and Mozambique, in part because they have become such a fundraising juggernaut. In fact, the sort of parent organization of Akashinga used to be known as the International Anti-Poaching Federation. Last year, they changed their name to just be the Akashinga because the kind of gender side of the work became so influential in the kind of international fundraising space that they kind of opted to focus on that as their organizing principle, kind of jettisoning that original wider mandate that they had. Notably, the founder of Akashinga is an Australian man, former Australian Special Forces, who has said in these fundraising talks he doesn't consider himself a feminist, is not familiar with concepts like ecofeminism. Although he was on a podcast in 2019 where he said, I will read a book on ecofeminism. That sounds interesting. And this was, of course, several years after he founded this all-female team. So I say that not to, sort of dismiss him as an individual, but rather to highlight the ways in which we need to think about these programs not necessarily being very thoughtful about some of the other practices that they are embedded in. One aspect of this project is that I'm really aiming at trying to elevate the women's voices themselves. So as I mentioned, the founders of these programs tend to predominate in the public perceptions, in their public relations, in their fundraising efforts. So trying to elevate what do these programs mean for the women who participate them in and of themselves. It is a qualitative-based project, which we'll talk about in methods, and you get a sense of why I'm trying to kind of foreground women here. And then lastly, this project is trying to unpack some of those essentialisms that are built into assumptions about why this is a kind of good project or good kind of policy to pursue. So these are the kind of gendered essentialisms that argue women are inherently more caring for the environment and more attuned to questions of climate and so forth. And the idea that men are a kind of more malign force in the environment, that they're more susceptible to wildlife crime, they're more susceptible to over exploitation. And so it's really trying to unpack that has been the central focus here. So I've just put up my sets of research questions here, very qualitative and exploratory research questions, thinking through what it means to consider the social identities and how they intersect with these policy interventions. Thinking about the efficacy of these interventions, right? What evidence do we have that they work differently and or better or worse for that matter? And also trying to think through why they have come about from a kind of policy and institutional process tracing, why they come about, why they've become so common, and then how they're shaping these society environment dynamics at a variety of scales, particularly the local level, which I think is often under-discussed, and the kind of local impacts there. In terms of literatures, there are kind of three broad literatures in the environmental history, gender and environment, and then from political science, an investigation of gender prioritized policy programs that might be kind of outside of the environmental sector, but are deeply interconnected. So if we think about the history of environmental management in Africa, it's long been raced, gendered, and classed, with certain actors originally colonial actors, and then in the post-colonial era, often kind of expatriate experts, still being able to structure relationships between humans and their natural surroundings in ways that sometimes these programs, I think, evaluate the kind of longue durée of that history. The second is the kind of debates in ecofeminism, which we know our founder of the Akashinga has no time for, but I spend a lot of time thinking through the sort of balance between that difference ecofeminism that argues for a kind of metaphysical difference of women and men in the environment. It's a kind of older tradition in ecofeminism that relies on some essentializing discourses as well, the idea of the kind of earth mother, the nurturing context. And then the more contemporary feminist political ecology critiques that suggest, in fact, a more social ecofeminism, which is attuned to the political context and is very wary of these essentialisms, has sort of written back across these debates, arguing that women's proximity to environmental stress or resource stress are typically tied to their social, political, and economic positions, not a kind of inbuilt connection or inbuilt inherent closeness to nature. So I'm guiding, my project is being guided by these insights from social ecofeminism, from feminist political ecology, that are very wary of the essentializing tropes that are at the heart of a lot of this discourse. And then finally, from political science, there has been an emerging literature on all-female or female prioritized policing, military, and peacekeeping units that have cropped up in the last 20 or so years in a variety of contexts, also very much focused in the Global South, very famously the all-female Indian peacekeepers that were deployed in Sierra Leone and West Africa. A kind of key example there. And this literature walks through what it means to bring women into a highly masculinized and militarized context. And I think, in fact, this literature is really important to think about in the context of all-female environmental and climate policy initiatives, in part because they often adopt a very martial grammar to them. So they, whether it's rangers, or wildlife monitors, they drill in the way that you would see kind of attuned to the security sector policy units that we can see here. So I'm trying to bridge this gap, right, to bring that in from political science and kind of speak to what's going on, perhaps in a more feminist political ecology lens. And I will note that the gendered policy programs that have been more focused on unpacking the security sector efforts tend to not speak to what's happening in the environment and climate space, which I think maybe reflects a little bit of a myopia in political science to not work in concert with human geography or political ecology as an example. I also want to think about the policy terrain in which these are being deployed. So in the next couple of slides, I'll look at some case studies, but this is the sort of universe in which these programs have become very common. So of course, there is gender highlighted as an important topical stream within the UNFCCC, gender and the Convention on Biodiversity. There is sort of a series of gender plans of action related to that regime. Of course, in the Sustainable Development Goals, Target 5 is specifically focused on gender, but Target 13B is highlighting and articulating women as a particular sort of population of interest, potentially historically marginalized in the management of climate change and other environmental issues. And then lastly, I want to highlight the SADC Protocol on Gender and Development, which SADC is the regional organization in Southern Africa, the Southern African Development Community, and they have a long-standing policy of trying to push member states, which include the states that the states where I have my case studies, to mainstream gender into development practice as well as participation across a variety of venues. So in addition to the academic literature, there's a whole set of sort of prevailing policy instruments that might in some cases be very operational and other cases be perhaps more aspirational. But it's important to kind of get the lay of the land there from the policy perspective. You can glean a lot about how these programs present themselves before you even get into the field. The way in which, for example, various programs tend to use often very essentialized ideas about women in the environment, and they also tend to adopt what I call the twinned gender essentialism of men and women. That the unspoken subtext of why these programs are better for the environment and better for climate transition is the way in which they tend to subtly pathologize African men in ways that harken back to some of the colonial practices of pathologizing men in the colonial era. So, for example, the idea that African men are more susceptible to corruption or to rent seeking, criminality, untrustworthiness, that they have this kind of embodied potentiality for violence. Ergo, women are the better route to go in these spaces, where very often many of these programs, of course, are armed programs, like the anti-poaching programs in particular. And so what I'm trying to do is really unpack these essentialisms, because while the programs are sort of nominally focused on women's empowerment, they're also doing something very particular with a population that has long been pathologized. In terms of my methods, so I have done fieldwork in Botswana and Zimbabwe for about 8 months in total across 3 years, 2022, 23, and 24. The first 2 rounds of fieldwork were funded by my Fulbright grant through the Africa Regional Research Program. And it's a qualitative study. I have about 200 individual interviews, about a half dozen focus groups, dozens of hours of participant observation. This includes, going on patrol with these all-female groups or the mixed gender groups that are prioritizing women, sort of seeing what their work is. In addition to the on-the-ground work, I'm doing a policy and discourse analysis. So looking not only at the international level policies that I kind of referenced, but also national gender policies and how they interface with some of the environmental and climate goals of states. And then, of course, analyzing things like the public presentation of these programs, in part because they spend a lot of time on publicly presenting themselves, because they do quite a bit of fundraising, and often the all-female or women prioritized teams are major boons in terms of fundraising. I'm also trying to make sense institutionally of what we're looking at, creating a typology of the very, very many different types of programs that I'm kind of categorizing as gender prioritized. So there are all female initiatives where they're sort of separately created that everything, all the wildlife monitors, all the eco guides, they're all going to be women. The caveat there is very often the management are not, but the participants for a particular objective, they're all women, where be it the Akashinga, as I mentioned, in Zimbabwe, or an all-female eco guide team in Chobe National Park in Botswana. Then you also have mixed gender initiatives, which are explicitly aimed at parity. They sort of say, well, why can't this workplace, why can't this environmental workforce have 50% men and 50% women? And so this typically requires not setting up a new initiative, but rather trying to bring an equal number of women into an existing wildlife monitor team or what have you. And then lastly was what I call the female inclusive initiatives, where the idea is, well, we'll bring a few women in to a group or a team to kind of allow them to be included, but it's still predominantly a male workforce. The government programs tend to look like this. So for example, if you look at wildlife and ecosystem rangers in Zimbabwe under the aegis of Zimparks, they are historically almost all men. They bring in 2 or 3 women into the mix. And then there's the kind of institutional structure of what these programs look like. You have commercial programs, which are almost all exclusively associated with the wildlife tourism industry, and they have very clear commercial ends, right? The eco guides here. Their goal is maybe to employ more women as eco guides, but their goal is to get people to go on their safaris, and they use the eco guides as a big selling point. You have nonprofit programs, which are affiliated with an NGO or a foundation, a charitable trust. Sometimes these two are connected. So the commercial program might have a spin-off foundation. The case that we're going to look at is that. There are public-private programs as well, where you might have an NGO that is working directly with a subnational body like a local district council to fund, the forest guardians that protect that forest or whatever it might be. But they are technically under the aegis of council or some equivalent. And then lastly, this was something that I've kind of added into my analysis over some time after presenting this in various places, that there are grassroots sort of community, informal, almost by default, all-female groups of people in small communities that are working towards environmental and climate ends, but they are very distinct from the other 3 categories in that they're largely sort of through necessity, groups of women in communities thinking about how they manage their resources, their water, so on and so forth, where the other 3 are very much a kind of top-down initiative. I want to think a little bit about one case study here, and this is the Great Plains Foundation. This is a foundation model that is associated with a large, very high-end luxury tourism outfit. So they operate in Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. I have the asterisk there for Kenya because currently none of their programming in Kenya has any kind of gender or women's empowerment focus, but both in Botswana and Zimbabwe, that's a big part of their work. So the 2 programs I want to pull out from Great Plains Foundation are their female rangers. These are women that do wildlife monitoring. Very specifically, the goal is to hire women, gendered recruitment for their role in wildlife monitoring, forestry, and to some extent overlap with some pre-existing anti-poaching operations. And then there is the community-based women-only solar deployment and education initiative known as the Solar Mamas. So this is there's a small set of villages on the periphery of where Great Plains works in Botswana, not electrified, very rural, and women are identified in that community. Women only are identified in the community to learn about solar technology, very small deployment of rooftop solar. And in some of these, there's several villages that participate. The only electricity outside of government buildings like the clinic or the school that have electricity are the Solar Mamas rooftop. So these are all female initiatives that are embedded within a larger organizational structure, a charitable foundation, that says that their goal is gender parity. That's their kind of stated institutional goal. This is a nonprofit that is the spin-off or charitable wing of Great Plains Conservation, which is a very, very high-end wildlife tourism safari operator. They operate in Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. Great Plains Foundation is a US and UK registered charity. So they get donations themselves, but they also have a bed night donation system where for every one bed night that someone stays in, Great Plains, Duba Plains luxury safari camp, money goes to the foundation. But they're sharing resources because the camps that are focused on ecosystem and wildlife monitoring on the concessions that Great Plains runs are using or piggybacking off of the luxury safari camps. So in many ways, right, they are piggybacking off of these diesel generator powered luxury camps that are kind of in the middle of nowhere. So there, again, there's, I think, an important reflection on the climate perspectives here. Notably, in Zimbabwe in particular, the area that Great Plains Foundation sort of monitors is largely has greater capacity than Zim Parks, which is the government entity that is supposed to maintain those national parks and other protected areas. So the foundation essentially becomes the key institutional actor in these places because the state entity is so under-resourced that they become very, very dependent on these programs. So I have some pictures of the solar mamas here in the western edge of the Okavango Delta in Botswana. I particularly think this picture is instructive, right? They are all given laptop bags. There are no laptops in the bags, but they are given laptop bags. They pose with them. It sort of presents a particular image or vision. This is one of the rooftop solar being deployed. This is, classic, I would say, fundraising image of a solar mama. This is me here in the Okavango Delta with 3 of the wildlife and ecosystem monitors. These were women that were hired specifically and only because they were sort of targeted to be hired because they were women. They do work alongside an all-male ranger team, but they do not patrol together. They patrol separately. So I want to wrap up by thinking through some of the initial findings here, focusing primarily on the women's experiences themselves. So at the top, I do want to note that the programs that I've observed, both on the ground and through sort of online ethnographic methods, are major fundraising draws. That is very clear. The development officers are very clear to say these are great for our fundraising objectives. And in fact, they argue we are able to patrol more land. We are able to deploy more solar because there's such good fundraising sort of fodder that we have seen big spikes is not the right word, but more consistent and more robust funding, in part because they're able to leverage the image of these gender prioritized teams. So I think it's very true that we are seeing kind of greater activity in these spaces. But also, on the other hand, all of these activities are deeply tied to an ecotourism model that is very climate intensive, that is at best under accounted for in these operations, and at worst might be quite deleterious. There's no definitive evidence that these groups do their job particularly differently than their male counterparts, but often do very similar jobs in specifically different kinds or more taxing circumstances that I'll work my way through. And these policies generally exist in places that don't have a lot of political buy-in. Either in the case of Zimbabwe, there's just not enough of a sort of robust and equipped state to really care that much. They sort of outsource a lot of the programming to these kinds of NGOs. Or in the case of Botswana, there is actually greater hostility to the programs from a political context. Botswana has what we call a gender neutral constitution. It's gender blind. And there have been some politicians who've said actually preferencing women in this hiring is in fact violating labor law and actually should not continue. So there's a bit more pushback in the context of Botswana than there is in Zimbabwe. But I want to wrap up by thinking about the findings in the context of how women see themselves in these programs, thinking about the local and grassroots level as an important strata for analysis. So the first is that these programs are overwhelmingly top-down. And I don't think this was very surprising. It's quite intuitive, but it was really important to kind of glean this out through fieldwork, that these programs are sort of mandated or the brainchild of management that then become operational on the ground. One other aspect was, as I mentioned, the fundraising success. As they've become incredibly valuable sources of fundraising for these NGOs and other operators on the ground, they've kind of proliferated. So later adopters of the all-female or gender prioritized model have said, oh yeah, we saw how well it was working for Akashinga or for Great Plains, so we initiated a program ourselves. And this, I think, is quite important. Particularly also with respect to the programs being top-down, the very often male expatriate leaders of these programs tend to be the public face of them. They do fundraising tours. They're sometimes, doing tours in the United States and Europe and Australia for months at a time. And so what does that mean when we think about these programs as trying to blend environmental policy with women's empowerment? I think there's an open question there. The programs also present themselves as instrumental, right? Women are better at this, going back to that gendered essentialism that I spoke about. But the women themselves, when you speak to them, they don't use an instrumental logic. They say, we're not better at this than men, but we have a right to be employed in this way, right? They use a rights-based approach, not a kind of instrumental or essentializing approach, which I think is very interesting. It shows that disconnect between leadership and participants. Women join these organizations for a variety of reasons, but the emphasis in public discourse that it's the kind of earth mother, women are more nurturing, that's why they are attracted to these programs, is not borne out at all from my fieldwork. Participants describe far more prosaic reasons. These are places where employment is incredibly hard to come by. And so women are very happy to be working, but they're not particularly drawn to this sector through any kind of like metaphysical connection to nature, despite the fact that this is often how they're presented in the public-facing renderings of these programs. In fact, many women talk about, well, I'm going to work here as an eco guide, or I'm going to engage with the Solar Mama program so that I can accumulate some capital and then go and open a small shop or buy some property, become a landlady, right? This is very clearly seen as just like a way to manage a very difficult economic situation. I do want to touch on the kind of family sentiments. Very often they're presented in the kind of external telling of the programs as, challenging family norms. And this is true to some extent, but a surprising number of respondents said, actually, my father was very supportive of me taking this route. And I think that, again, goes back to the way in which some of these programs are relying on a pathologizing of African men in ways that I think are problematic, right? That there is some family support there in ways that are unexpected. When we talk about gender politics, we talk about descriptive, symbolic, and substantive representation. I would argue that these are really descriptive representation, these programs, right? There are more women in these programs than there are before, but that doesn't necessarily mean there is underlying transformation that we might see with more substantive representation. One thing we also see is that there are unintended consequences to the way in which, as these programs have been elevated, it has shut out women from other sectors in the industry. So I have a respondent who said, I'm a trained safari guide. I worked as an eco guide at Chobe Game Lodge, and I wanted to work somewhere else. And they said, no, women work there. All the other jobs in this sector are reserved for men. You go work at the all-female program. And what it ends up doing is sort of limiting or precluding women from perhaps being sort of seen as full participants in the environmental workforce when they are hived off into the all-female or gender prioritized programs or teams. We see this also in there's literature looking at this in the 2010 Kenyan Constitution. There was the creation of what's called a women's representative. And it's meant that now women basically can't run for senator or governor because they said, well, no, you're a woman, you're supposed to run for women's representative. And the other positions are sort of subtly said to be reserved for men. So we're kind of seeing this happen as well in the places where the all-female teams have become really prominent. There is a big divide between commercial and non-commercial programs. The commercial programs really deploy a very highly feminized presentation. They say we do our job differently than women, right? We're better eco guides than men because we're attentive to client needs, right? They wear jewelry and makeup, whereas the non-commercial programs that don't face clients tend to adopt very martial or masculine grammars in their presentation. They wear sort of paramilitary or quasi-military uniforms, and they explicitly say, no, we do our job just as well as men, right? We can adopt those registers just as well. And so you do see that disconnect there. And I think that is insight into the political economy a little bit, right? The fact that fee-paying tourists are really interested in this highly essentialized kind of gender operation. There's also some really important unintended consequences of the symbolic representation. So I was doing field work with a mixed gender team, men and women. We did a 15-kilometer early morning patrol. I was told that they did it light for me. That was like half of their normal patrol. So we do 15 kilometers in the morning, and we returned back to the camp, which was right next to a safari camp. And before anyone could rest or bathe or eat, two of the women were said, you have to go talk to the tourists now. You have to go directly to talk to the tourists, give them a talk about the environment and how climate is impacting Zimbabwe, so on and so forth. And I asked, well, does that rotate? They said, no, only the women ever do that. The male members of the team can go back and rest. The women have to go do this sort of other level of unpaid labor because they are symbols, right? So that symbolism ends up becoming something that we need to kind of think through or problematize. That symbolic representation can have some of those knock-on impacts. The title of this talk is Mother's Nature. And in fact, most of the participants are mothers. But this is problematized in ways that I think these programs under assess. For example, in between 2 rounds of field work, I returned back and there were several women who had been terminated from their roles because they had either gotten pregnant or had recently had babies, and there was no way for the programs to account for that. So there is a lot of discourse or rhetoric about empowering women, but when the rubber meets the road, it's a lot more complicated than that. Similarly, there is no discussion of the unpaid labor by older women in families that facilitate these kinds of programs. So labor sociologists of Southern Africa have long noted that basically older rural women allow for the reproduction of the labor class because they are home in the village and they take care of the children when the parent goes out to work. So you have the Earth Mother, going out and protecting the environment, but we don't talk about that grandmother tax that allows or facilitates that process. And the last finding that I thought was the most fascinating was that when you ask participants in all female teams, participants in mixed gender teams, men and women participants, so I interviewed both men and women in the mixed gender teams, when you ask about their desire for the institutional structures that they work in, they say, we want a mixed gender team. Even among those who work in the all-female context, almost unanimously, people said they much prefer a mixed gender team. And I think if your concern or your interest is in sort of changing mindsets, the mixed gender team might have more value or utility there. I spoke to some men on the mixed gender teams who said, I was really not interested in this before management decided that we were going to have to be 50-50. I thought women wouldn't be able to do it, and I was wrong. And they've been great, and they began to speak in a very gender egalitarian language to justify the mixed gender teams, which I found to be very interesting. And so, if the goal is to kind of change the baseline of women's empowerment in a community, maybe the mixed gender team has more utility there as a political, or excuse me, as a policy structure. The problem is if your goal is fundraising, that might not be the best or most useful approach. So I had one respondent say to me, you don't get into National Geographic for having a 50-50 unit, but you will if the group is all female. So there's sort of mitigating pressures or cross pressures about how these programs are structured. So to wrap up, what are the future directions of this? Continued desk research, of course. There's reams and reams and reams of public relations material that I need to kind of go through from a discourse analysis perspective. Possibly some additional field work. I've worked in Botswana and Zimbabwe, but there are all female teams in South Africa, Zambia, Kenya, and Tanzania as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, and I'd love to get out more into the field. I also am particularly interested in trying to pick apart and think about the role of the sort of what I call the charismatic founder, the men that have started these organizations. I've been working on a paper about them that I recently presented at 2 African Studies conferences that I'd love to work through a bit more. And then I'm very interested in trying to tease apart the layers of the descriptive, symbolic, and substantive representation in this space, both in the kind of on-the-ground policy initiatives that I've been talking about today, but then also in things like climate change advocacy, in the international negotiations at the various treaty regimes, in policy making, what are the gender dynamics looking at there? This will be ideally the kind of bulk of my second book project, and a couple of articles spinning out from there as well. Separate and apart from my focus on gender, the other aspect of my research is thinking through the international relations related to global environmental governance from the position of the Global South, which tends to not necessarily often rise to the level of attention that I think it warrants, particularly thinking through the intra-regional international relations among countries in Southern and Eastern Africa. And the way in which African states have a unique position in climate change politics, in the sense that they vary heavily from the kind of industrialized states of the global north, but also have very different interests and agendas from the kind of new emerging economies of China, Brazil, India. You have African states that have very little culpability for climate change, but have some of the highest future resource needs. The bulk of population growth in the 21st century is going to happen in Africa. It's a very young continent. So thinking through the unique position that these states play in the global governance around climate, I think is an important part or additional part of my research that I'm really excited to think through while here at University of Maine. So those are just some of the sources that I've used today. So thank you so much for your attention. I would love to go into more detail about any of these cases or any of the programs, and hopefully have a little bit of time for Q&A.
We have time for one or two questions.
Great.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm interested in the effect of the kind of relatively weak state power in the region and how that influences these groups, especially since expanding state capacity in the developing world is another one of the major UN initiatives for Africa, Southern Africa. So would an increase in state power, should these initiatives be successful, potentially result in a nationalizing of these groups, or like a parallel group, or a pushing out of the need for this private group? And what implications do you think that would have for this venture as a whole?
Yeah. Do we take questions and then answer? What do you prefer?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a question of state capacity, but then there's also a question of like the legal and institutional frameworks in which these programs exist. So if we just look at Botswana and Zimbabwe, for example, the constitutional frameworks there are very different, and that will impact what we mean by like if the state is strong, how it will operate. So for example, Botswana has a very old constitution in an African context. It's essentially the 1965 constitution that was inherited from the British. It was never meaningfully changed or amended in a very substantially. So you can imagine a constitution written in 1965 by British colonial powers. It's not attentive to gender at all. It's not attentive to basically any kind of identity groups within the state. It's what we would call a gender blind or a gender neutral constitution. And that has allowed some politicians within Botswana to be very directly adversarial to these kinds of programs, because they say they are unfairly elevating, gender above, free employment, as it were. Whereas the Zimbabwean constitution is established after 1980, after the end of the Liberation War. It is a gender sensitive constitution. It's a weak political system in the sense that that doesn't mean that gender sensitive constitution is ever sort of made real, but there is a gender ombudsman, I always say that word wrong, in the society, right? There's a gender commission. There are clauses in the Constitution that is attentive to achieving parity between men and women, right? That's completely absent in the Botswana context. So separate and apart from state capacity, right, the constitutional and institutional structures matter here, because that is going to shape the legal framework. Ironically, in Botswana, you have more state capacity, but a gender blind legal and constitutional structure. In Zimbabwe, you have a gender sensitive legal structure and very weak state capacity or disinterested state capacity, right? As I mentioned, like a lot of areas of the country's Zim parks is essentially outsourcing to interested NGOs that can fill that gap. The Akashinga group, they have a concession in northeastern Botswana, or excuse me, northeastern Zimbabwe, and they kind of do what they want. Technically, non-state actors are not supposed to import weapons into Zimbabwe, but Akashinga can do that, right? So that tells you about like the institutional structures that are kind of at play in how these programs roll out. As for the future, I'm not quite sure what that will look like, right? But I think you have to merge legal and constitutional frameworks with a kind of state capacity framework to have any kind of predictive power there.
My experience in South America, you talked several times about the negative perception of African men, but you didn't link it to the perception, and maybe it doesn't exist, that women are less corruptible, less likely to be bribed, and therefore better for enforcement. Is that? That's the other side of the coin, right? One of the justifications is women are closer to nature, they're less corruptible. Very famously, one of the leaders of these programs said, if you give a woman, in the Zimbabwean context, if you give a woman a gun, it's a tool. If you give a man a gun, it's a toy. We can debate whether that's true or not, but there is the two sides of that essentializing coin. Men are corruptible, they can be violent, they're bad for the environment. Women are, better economizers, they're thoughtful about community, they are not violent for violence sake, that all of this gets tied up into that. You can't have one without the other, I would argue. Thank you, I suspected, but. Yeah. I should have made that clear. When I talk about the twin gendered essentialisms, they're essentially, yeah. They still have a tremendous problem with corruption, and that includes police. So they hired a lot of women to be police, but they seem to only put them in the cities. I stopped getting stopped and pushed for bribes in the cities, but they don't seem to let them be on the highway patrol. I have to stop twice a year. So it hasn't gotten rid of it. It just maybe helped it. Is it the perception of men, at least police, it seems to be absolutely true. And so I can tell it's not the perception of women. It may also be true, but I don't know. So the literature around the all-female policing and security sector, all-female or gender prioritized groups speak to that a lot. And that's one of the things I'm trying to merge in my research, is to kind of bring that political ecology and the political science into dialogue, because there's more of that in the policing literature, the security sector literature. That's one of the arguments as well for women in UN peacekeeping. There's a kind of violence argument, but also a corruption argument that is often deployed. And in the peacekeeping context, it's not necessarily borne out empirically.
There's some evidence that there's more kind of effective peacekeeping in terms of the violence, but the question of corruption is not, there's no, as of yet, not clear evidence of that in peacekeeping. In the policing, yeah.
Now that there are more women leaders, they do equally well.
That's empowerment, right?
Thank you.